music? China? What are they even saying? What is this Chinese rap music? Sounds like they're just saying ching chang chong.
My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
Hello and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm your host, Jordan Schneider. Why did Shenzhen, a backwater fishing village, spawn the likes of world beaters ZTE, Huawei, and Lenovo? Why Suzhou, which early on scored massive investments from top dragonhead foreign firms like Samsung and Philips, failed to spawn domestic innovation? What role did FDI and local bureaucrats in charge of economic development play? And what lessons does this story hold for today's Chinese industrial policy as well as development and innovation economics more broadly? For answers, we turn to Ling Chen, professor of political economy at Johns Hopkins SAIS and author of the recent Manipulating Globalization, the Influence of Bureaucrats on Business in China. Ling Chen, thanks so much for coming on China Econ Talk.
Hi, Jordan. Thank you. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. And it's my pleasure to be here.
So how did you first get into researching local government development policy?
Well, it's a bit of a long story, but essentially, I became very interested in political economy in general while I was back in Beida. I was a Beida undergrad when I took a couple courses with people who returned, who was educated in the United States and then returned to China to Beida to teach. And then later, when I myself went to the United States to pursue my PhD, I became really fascinated with the interaction of political economy factors like government-business relations. And at that time, China was not that a big thing compared to the East Asian developmental state like Japan, South Korea, the Taiwan economy. So that's why I thought, it would be fascinating to examine China and look at some of the China's political economy or development policies.
Would you mind comparing the teaching style and content focus at Beida versus the Western institutions you studied at?
Well, Beida was actually a long time ago, but one of the contrasting thing, I'm more talking about Beida education just in traditional way. While I was at Beida, was more focused on telling or guiding students on a lot of the topics that how the world should be, or what is the way that you should interpret the world. So interpretation and understanding is the main thing, and it's more of a guided way of letting you know what you should think of the world, whereas in Western institutions really just they want you to think for yourself and come up with your own model or your own theory and explanation about the puzzles. So causal explanations are emphasized much more in some of the Western institutions. Yeah. But it's tied and social with the general institutional setting, but political economy setting of the two different worlds of in China and Western institutions. And the education, the goal of education is different, right? In China, education is to make you become a more talented and qualified person that give you a diploma or give you something that you can hold on to in order to make a more advanced career. But in Western institution education or more focus on your, innovation capacity or how to train your brain to think. So the train you to think part was not emphasized as much in back in China compared to the Western institutions. However, that said, by the time I left Beida, at least at that time, it already started to change because they started to import and have scholars that are educated in, say, Columbia or Cornell or Harvard, sea turtles coming back to Beida to teach. So they bring in the model of sort of more like from the U.S. institutions to there.
So what sort of reception did you get with these local bureaucrats?
Yeah, I was extremely lucky back then. I did my interviews across the years mostly across the year of 2009, 2010, 2011. And so that was right before the current regime started. And bureaucrats were, in general, quite friendly because I I had some pre-existing networks. They welcomed me. I stay in nice hotels, and they bring me to various banquets, and we're usually typically during banquets they're more honest about how things are going, what are the major difficulties for this locality's development. So they chat quite openly, and even I would say that even in some of the formal government meetings where there are bureaucrats are sitting around, like in a round table in their own seminar room inside the government, which of course I'm not allowed to take pictures. So of course, but at that time I didn't have iPhone, so I didn't take picture anyway, because iPhone make taking picture much easier. Because it's not possible you take like a camera out and just say I'm going to take a picture of you, right? That's awkward. But anyway, so even in office buildings and seminar rooms, officials when they sit around, they started to chat. They're also quite frank and honest about their views. For example, there's officials sometimes from the science and technology department would definitely not like those officials that are attracting foreign direct investment, and thinking those other people are not really understanding what is the real path for development. So they're going to speak, so they actually speak very openly, not just in front of me, but in front of other bureaucrats that are from other departments as well. But that's just back then the story.
Okay, so let's go now to these two phases that you talk about. So first, what was going on with FDI attraction in the 90s to early 2000s? Can you talk a little bit about the initial dynamics there?
So the 90s to early 2000 was really the golden period for China's attraction of foreign direct investment, and that's where also large quantity of systematic FDI started happening in China. So for people who are doing like China Economy 101, typically we associate the year 1978 as China's economic reform and opening. But it really was in the 1990s that systematically FDI came into China. And that's whenever you look at the graph of FDI inflow in China, it almost seems like before 1990, it's just zero. You couldn't see where the 9 is. Whereas after 1990, the graph started to suddenly rise up very high, and that's why. And so there are various kinds of foreign direct investment pouring to China, but a lot of them are actually a result of local bureaucrats actually attracting foreign direct investment and bringing in the investors to set up plans.
So the incentives that various cities would give to these foreign companies were pretty enormous. You have a quote from a manager of a Japanese electronics branch in Suzhou who regarded these beneficial policies as simply hard to believe because they were not seen in any other developing countries. So what were the incentives on a provincial basis for different localities to give up such sweetheart deals to these large international technology players?
Yeah, that was when I was talking about in Suzhou, and of course in a lot of similar locality as well, where you provide them with tax reduction or tax break that was very generous. Either it's typically is the first 3 years is completely tax exemption, and then the next 2 to 5 years, or they're only submitting like half of their corporate income tax. Right, and then it's also added on top of that. It's because the entire package is discount in the use of land to build the factory. In fact, a lot of times the local government actually arrange to build the factory for them because they have to dislocate all the peasants that are originally associated with those land, and there are other like utility discount. And so it's a lot of good deals that are offered. And back then, it was because also that there were a lot of local competition. So indeed, you heard a story. For example, Compal was the second largest global manufacturer for like iPads, things or computers, or laptop computers. And then the origin was going to locate to Shanghai, but then the Kunshan government under Suzhou actually had a much better deal. So after Shanghai already allocated land to start build the factory for them, they suddenly decide that Compal said that Suzhou has a better deal, so they went there. So that's basically the story when they're trying to attract large multinational corporations.
And can you contrast this with what's going on in Shenzhen at the time? It seems like they had a bit of a different philosophy as opposed to giving these enormous deals to big foreign players.
Well, so at Shenzhen and the broader like Pearl River Delta, it's also the governments were also offering good deals. But don't get me wrong, that they're also offering a lot of good deals. However, they're less picky. That is that they're less focused on they have a less focus on the kind of control, almost like I have to be a control freak, that kind of mentality. And they actually just say, we can just get whatever we can get. And at that time, at the Pearl River Delta, there are a lot of different types of firms. There probably are bigger firms, but a huge number of them are smaller firms, which I call guerrilla investors. That there are a lot of times from the China circle, for example, Hong Kong or Taiwan or Singapore or Macau, and they actually invested in China. A lot of times, these investors used to be just the relatives of a known Chinese mainlander, and then they established the linkages and brought them in. So there's not a scenario where if you're smaller than 30 million US dollars, then I'm not going to look at you and I do not want you to come in. There's not that kind of a scenario.
So let's fast forward a little bit to the idea of domestic innovation, which has been the general push from the mid-2000s to the present. So first off, would you want to talk a little bit about the disappointment or the relative disappointment that some people had towards this initial phase of FDI attraction and why the shift towards indigenous innovation?
The shift came from both a top-down form and a bottom-up form. So in terms of top-down, it was during that time, because we have attracted foreign direct investment at whatever costing. A lot of localities are bringing a lot of them. So a lot of manufacturing industry started to be dominated by the foreign enterprises, and not just that, they're just using China as sort of a cheap manufacturing base, and then the goods are then exported outside. And this scenario caused concern both among the policymakers and among the some of the scholars. So, for example, the Ministry of Science and Technology, I believe, under the help of some top-level scholars, drafted a report, a very long report about the importance to actually have develop an indigenous innovation program for China, so that China is not overly dependent on foreign technology. And they emphasize such importance and why it is important, not just for the sake of economic nationalism, but for the sake of the fact that if you do not control the core technology, if you do not control the core product concept, you are forever just going to make the peripheral components, because no matter how good you make peripheral components, there's not going to be a direct jump to that making the core components unless you really push for that. So anyway, so these reports also was brought to the attention of the leaders such as Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. That's when they started to emphasize indigenous innovation. But more also at the local level, there is some voice of, not in terms of indigenous innovation, but in terms of in the form of industrial upgrading, already started going on in the later part of 1990s when their localities have rising costs of labor and input of materials, that there's too much rise in the cost that they feel like there's a lot of pressure, that they almost feel there's a pressure for them to be, the market pressure would wanted them to push them for upgrading as well.
So let's take a bit of a sidestep before we come back to this question of domestic innovation and talk a little bit about what drives local bureaucracies. So one of the two things you highlight is the cadre evaluation system, writing that, quote, unlike Western democracies, the ruling political elites in China are motivated by accountability from above rather than below. And you have this great document which shows the actual equation that scores various bureaucrats for promotion. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about promotion incentives within the cadre evaluation system and how that ends up playing out from a policy perspective.
Yeah, that is actually a very interesting part. Is that because earlier on we were talking about central government trying to promote indigenous innovation, that people's daily trying to say, we really need to do that, right? But the reason that is important is you also have to observe once it gets to localities, what the local bureaucrats are doing. And so they are local bureaucrats' incentives are driven by at least a very important part of it is this promotion system. Now, I'm not saying that by looking at the cadre evaluation system, by looking at the equation of how to calculate the score, then they are indeed going to promote in that way. No, it's not actually going to be that exactly in reality, because if this is really the case, then China would have, the bureaucracy would have a 100% transparency, right? And then will be 100% predictable. Everything can be calculated by an equation. So that's not the case, but their incentives are driven by promotion system, which means that they truly believe that in general, that my performance or achievement or whatever the kind of investment that I tracked are associated with this kind of the cadre evaluation system. That basically is different from the Western democracies, which you have accountability from below, from the voters. Here we have the elites are having accountability from above. So it's really the lower level. So it's the upper level bureaucrats evaluate the lower level bureaucrats, and so the provincial leaders will evaluate the city leaders, and city leaders themselves will evaluate the department heads, and department heads will then evaluate the normal staff.
So I guess there's the obvious question that follows out of this is, to what extent at the broad level, are these promotions meritocratic? On the one hand, you have a whole lot of folks who can trace their lineage back to the Long March, who are in very senior levels, which doesn't necessarily make one think that meritocracy and how good your score is on water and air quality is really the thing that gets you up the food chain. But what was your sense at the meeting with these folks, to what extent they did and when they varied from this strict evaluation system?
So that depends on whatever the typical form, like there is a cadre evaluation example that is appendix of chapter 4 of my book, and typically what you see as an example are actually how provincial government evaluate the top leaders of the city governments. So that's why you see a lot of indicators ranging from economic development to air quality and unemployment rate, because as a top city leader, they have to consider all of them, right? So some of them are harder targets, some of them are softer targets. Later on, there are things like, how satisfied population is with your progress on science and technology. That is whatever that means, but that doesn't actually is not a hard measurement. Some of them are veto targets. For some reason, I didn't see them occurring in just that special case, which is Jiangsu. But for some reason, it occurs more frequently in inland China provinces. For example, Henan province would have. It used to be when China still have one-child policy, like the population increase, right? Or would have social stability, which means there's no major protest or instability events happening. So sometimes these things could be a veto targets, which means that if that happens, then that cancels out all your achievements. So you have to, I mean, it's very complicated. Each individual bureaucrat have to evaluate, but not all bureaucrats have to deal with all these things, because if I only work for the commerce department, then I only have a commerce department's evaluation that emphasize only one set of things instead of the environmental quality, for example. Yeah.
So the other thing you write about what drives local bureaucrats is this idea of fragmentation. And as centralized as many Western authors write about the Chinese economy, it really isn't, the 90s and 2000s China wasn't nearly as centrally directed as Korea and Japan in their kind of like centrally directed development heydays of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Instead, you put forward this idea of fragmented authoritarianism and a policy enforcement market. Can you elaborate on those ideas?
Yeah, that's two wonderful concepts. The fragmented authoritarianism was developed earlier by Mike Oxenberg and Ken Lieberthal, and then policy enforcement market, I draw on Andy Murtha's concept. But so all these are scholarly concepts, but what they're trying to capture China is that for China compared to like Korea or Japan, they are much more decentralized. So when we talk about Korea and Japan, and actually there's some valid observation here is that when we talk about these countries, it makes sense to say, for example, in Korea, what the Economic Planning Board says and what's the result of the industrial outcome. And then what in Japan, what the MIDI says, the ministry says, and then what is the outcome of Japan's industrial growth or industrial performance. But in China, it's quite complicated because the overall outcome we often observe, such as like GDP or technology progress, a lot of times are embedded in local context, and subnational governments are much more important. And also there's much more fragmentation, meaning that the bureaucracy are not acting as coherent as the other East Asian countries, that there are a lot more bureaucratic competition and different pursuing a different agenda across different departments.
Yeah, it sounds like way more fun to be a provincial mayor in China than in Japan.
Yeah. That's true. You don't have to be a provincial governor. You don't even have to be a Chinese city mayor. Even if you're just a county head. So there is the head of the county told me that I govern like more than a million people, and if I put in outside of context of China, I'm actually a king or something like that. So it's not, it's so it's in China. The context is quite different because within his county, assuming it's a him, within his county, it's actually there can be like thousands of firms or at least hundreds of firms there. So
did you run into any female bureaucrats in this research?
Oh yeah. So bureaucrats, if they're female, I find they're typically more considerating, that they do not ask me to drink as much alcohol. And while they were there, it's also good. It's also good because with female bureaucrats, because she or they do not want to drink that much of alcohol. That kind of toned down the entire alcohol culture around the table.
Well, thank you all the female bureaucrats out there for saving Ling's liver. You mentioned that bureaucracies compete for survival, control of key policies, and the ability to build patron-client relationships with different parts of the government and companies. So talk a little bit about this inter-bureaucracy competition and what's going on with these dynamics.
Yeah, sure. That's important. That's very important when we understand bureaucracy. The incentive bureaucrats, basically, they compete because first they need to survive. Means that if they're deemed to be redundant, then the next, not next day, but maybe next year, they can be merged into another bureaucracy, or they can be basically abolished, and they do not want that to happen, right? They wanted to prove, and this we all understand, not just Chinese bureaucracy. I actually see that in part of U.S. bureaucracy as well. But anyway, so that is like you have to show that you have value of existence and you're doing something, and something you're doing is important, and it's related to their control of key policies, because by controlling these key policies, they give them the opportunity to build their political achievement, to build the points and achievement they want to earn under the cadre evaluation system. And also with the control policies that comes with economic resources. For example, if you control the policy of evaluating which enterprise is can be deemed as high-tech enterprise, then you gain the control of granting, because that is like authorizing this bureaucrats, authorizing this firm, high-tech firm status, so that the firm can actually be exempt or be exempt from tax payment, or at least have substantial tax reduction. So that is key for a lot of bureaucrats to compete, to grab for these policies, or sometimes I call it resource-bearing policies. And also, once you grab these resource-bearing policies, you can use that to build or consolidate your patron-client relationship with the business. So in China, these economic bureaucrats or technology bureaucrats, they typically have their own business clients that they work with for a long time, and that's what the business go to get resources or get approval. And what I'm talking about here is really not low stake, but fairly high stake, because think about it. If a business, before 2008, domestic business pay 33% of the corporate income tax, and foreign business pay about 15% of 15% of corporate income tax. But if you're granted with the status of high-tech, new and high technology firms, as we're promoting domestic upgrading, then you will be like those foreign enterprises and pay 15%.
So these bureaucrats and the ability they have to designate you as high tech and something that's important for China's future technology development can potentially make or break the entire operation and the entire profitability and the point of the whole investment in the first place.
Yeah. So they're quite important, and that's why these policies are quite important. And that why bureaucrats really care about these policies.
So you have this great quote from a Suzhou official in 2010 saying, quote, "Why are we trying so hard to promote the interests of our own business clients? Forget about those big words like making our city a better place. We have to get concrete benefits for ourselves. That was the biggest reason and the real reason." What was going on in that context? And explain the thinking behind that comment, please.
For Suzhou officials, when interviewed, it seems like they're fighting really hard for their local business clients, right? Well, the real reason is not exactly that they think their business clients are everything. It's also not because they're trying to make the city a better place to live. Probably as a byproduct it is, but really they wanted to have some concrete benefits for themselves. And exactly that's connect to what I just said before about bureaucratic incentives, is that once they actually fight for the interests of their own business clients, they actually were able to get concrete benefits, for example, kickbacks from the business clients. There's A and B, that if their business clients are happy with them and keep staying in there, that's then they can make continued investment in the city. That will make the bureaucrats look good in terms of the political achievement and performance, and in terms of how they performed in the policies, the key policies they control. So that basically enabled them to win in the bureaucratic competition. That's actually the key reason.
So I just spent 2 years at a master's program in China and China studies, and doing it, I watched a lot of iQIYI, but didn't necessarily gain too many hard skills. Had I only known that at the University of San Francisco's new masterate in applied economics, I could have learned something to actually make me super employable. R, SQL, machine learning, all that good stuff you actually see on job listings in Silicon Valley and Zhongguancun, not necessarily have you watched all of Huanlasong. So in this program, you can study the economics of platforms, auctions, and business strategy at the same time as you learn the tools of econometrics, experimental design, and machine learning. Plus, for all those non-US students out there, this program is designated STEM, so you can apply for a 3-year extension on your student visa and keep working in the US after you graduate. To learn more and get an application fee waiver, go to usfca.edu/Jordan. Can you talk a little bit about the dangers to domestic innovation that these big ticket, large scale, multi-million-dollar FDI projects had for Suzhou companies?
Okay, so the dangers at first were not, at first there were no dangers, there were only good things, because when they came in, those large firms, they also bring in their friends, right? They bring in their networks. So let's see, if the lead firm came in, or the OEM firms all came in, their assembly firms coming too. So in that case, in the particular case I was thinking about, it was even assembling was not conducted by a Chinese firm. It was the peripheral components was conducted and made by the Chinese firms. So at first, it's all good in bringing a lot of investment and money into the city. It was just much later on when China realized the Chinese firms need to move up the value chain. Then that becomes a bigger problem, because how are they going to move up? Because when they move, those firms at the bottom, when they try to move up, they are actually competing with their upstream customers, because in these global value chains, the customers are upstream firms. So they're competing with their own customers upstream, but not only with their upstream customer, they're competing with entire global chain that are populated by all these lead firms and OEM firms that they all know each other, and they're one big club. And the Chinese firms themselves are not that big club. So it's almost made them impossible to move up, and because of the incapability of competing with those upstream firms.
So you have another quote from a bureaucrat saying, "I constantly urge domestic firms to apply for patents to get approval for certain tax exemptions. I felt like I'm a policeman trying as hard as I can to catch these managers in order to force them to apply for patents. It's really for their own good." Ironically, I'm pretty sure that Ren Zhengfei did not need a bureaucrat to tell him to invest in his own R&D, but the incentives just really didn't seem to be there for the Chinese Suzhou electronics manufacturers or folks involved in the supply chains to spend their own money researching their own technology.
Oh yeah, that's right on. And I can tell you, Ren Zhengfei doesn't need a Chinese bureaucrat to tell them to do that. And I can talk a little more when we get to Shenzhen. But yeah, because the reason is that that a lot of these Chinese firms, they know that they cannot move up, and they do not have the incentive to move up because they're trapped at the lower part of the value chain. So there is they lacked the forces both from the pull and the push side. So from one side of the story, you could say at the lower part of the value chain, there's market competition so fierce because the assets are all replaceable, can be easily replaced. So they can, if that's the case, they will give them the incentives to actually move up, but not necessarily the case, because in Suzhou, again, the story is they match firms in a way that's highly controlled by bureaucrats. The bureaucrats actually, so for example, one of the, I shouldn't mention the name, the bureaucrat actually disassembled the entire laptop computer to know what are the components, and they just attract it according to the components of these computers, right? So they only allow certain firms to come in according to their own plan. That means even the firms are struggling at the bottom and having low profits, at least they're guaranteed more or less that they're still staying at the bottom of the chain without much market incentive to push them to upgrade. But also the government, on the government side, they're also not not pushing them. They're pushing them, but not pushing them in the right way. They're pushing them to actually to apply for patents. You should apply as many patents as possible. You should actually create this patent number so that our for example, Bureau of Science and Technology are going to look good. But they didn't understand that because from the bottom market side there's not a pressure, and from the top side, because of the top and medium part of the global value chains are all dominated by the same club, multinational corporation firms or their friends. They also do not have the incentive or in their mentality to see that there's a possibility of attractiveness for themselves, for these firms to move up the value chain. So there's a different parts of the story that's further trapped them at more at the bottom of the value chain.
You had this idea of the gap just being the technology gap just being too large, and it being kind of inconceivable for the domestic firms to kind of reach the place that the multinationals were at. So them just kind of believing, it was like Feijin. It was just not even worth it to start kind of climbing up that ladder.
Yeah. So don't get me wrong. At first, so there are stories where the multinational corporations, which are at a higher level value chain, trying to actually use the Chinese firm, for example, to make the glass substrate, the glass surface for their laptop computer, for example, because the laptop computer, the glass is highly important. That's not a normal glass. It's the most high tech glass, and most of firms cannot produce, right? So they used the Chinese firm at first to manufacture that glass for the computer screen, but they didn't work out. The reason is because that they bring in the firms that are too high on the value chain, whereas in the local level, there's not a capacity to build up yet. So the technology gap, or the gap that the multinational corporation required to fail, is too hard to be filled.
So you also had this little piece on how bad government programs just didn't die. Another quote I'm going to read out. So after we fight with other bureaucrats and I finally get these resources from the government, how could we simply point out that these firms aren't making a lot of technological progress? Saying that would mean hurting ourselves, as the government will refrain from giving us more money next time. We cannot complain about our difficulties in this way. Top city leaders will not understand the real problem and will take it as a sign of weakness. Care to elaborate on these dynamics?
Yeah. So it's related. Just in the story where there's a large technology gap, and the multinational corporation initially tried to use Chinese firms from the bottom, and it didn't work, right? So then they went back to using their friends, which are all other foreign firms, to do the production. So these firms, the Chinese firms, they are having a hard time upgrade, and it's good that the bureaucrats are trying to get them the funding, or science and technology coalition, that the coalition that I mentioned for the government. They are trying to say, if you please apply for patents, please upgrade. We give you the pockets of government funding, which is from the city level budgetary revenue, and it's under the science and technology spending. But after they give them this pockets of funding under whatever names or awards, they do not have a program to actually evaluate the results as closely. Part of the thing is that you evaluate your results. If you say that those firms that you award the money to are not doing the good thing in terms of the R&D, right, then you are not going to get this budget anymore. In these cities, the science and technology system bureaucrats are already very weak. If they say that we're not doing a good job, they're going to be even weaker compared to, let's say, bureaucrats that are under the international commerce or associated with multinational corporations. So that's not what they're going to say. And that then also further weakens the incentives for firms to make progress, because you get the grant for R&D, you get the grant for whatever science and technology thing, but you're not really doing what you're supposed to do. So that's kind of like a chicken and egg problems.
Let's turn now to Shenzhen. So what was going on here, and how did they? What were the factors that allowed this city to catch magic in a bottle?
Well, Shenzhen, I do not want to have an overly rosy picture of Shenzhen. Of course, Shenzhen has a lot of horror stories happen too, like with Shenzhen Foxconn, for example, with part of the environmental issue, part of the housing, real estate bubbles. But for all these problems, what happened with Shenzhen is eventually you see that it's. I mean, just we have to look at the fact that it is in this particular city or region that you saw firms starting from very low end of the value chain and starting very, very small pocket of money, very small startup, and then gradually grow to be more competitive. And okay, everyone knows Huawei now, but and back then when I was doing research, most people don't know Huawei. Majority of people almost absolutely do not know Huawei from here in the United States. But even back in China, if it's Chinese population, most people, a lot of people don't know either Huawei or ZTE. That's but I sense that there's something fundamentally different in Shenzhen, and that is, I mean, there's not actually a secret. It just basically they did the things they follow the things that it naturally supposed to do, is that they start with at the cheaper end, right? And the thing is that important is they build the horizontal linkages among firms. They started being very small and at low end of value chain, and there is a market pressure for them to upgrade, and also the government realized that the danger of being trapped at the lower end of the value chain, so they are pushing firms to upgrade. But unlike in Suzhou, their upper or medium levels of the value chain are not occupied. There are a lot of space for them. So when they evaluate, for example, when Ren Zhenfei was evaluating his very small, at that time he only have 21,000 RAB. So how are you gonna do anything with 21,000 yuan in China nowadays, right? So anyway, so he started with that much money at a small workshop, but of course he was driven out of profits. His profits become very low. At first, the profits was high. He buy the switches, telecommunication switches from Hong Kong, and then resell them in mainland. That kind of the price difference allow him to win profits. But a lot of people can do that. If you just buy in something and sell into the mainland, a lot of people can do that. That's why your asset is very likely to replace. That was why his profits dropped significantly, and he evaluated the situation thinking this is not going to be he cannot survive very long unless he invests. So that he started to invest like 60% of the his sales value in R&D, and started to do his own R&D, and basically he himself started indigenous innovation without even the central government in the 2006 to call on him to do that, right? That was much earlier on. And when he made this decision or evaluation that he needs to do that, he also think it's very attractive for him to do that because there's a lot of space at the higher level that other people are not doing, and he thinks it's also profitable, right? Profitable to do that. That's when he started to move up. But that's just one example. There are many firms that has felt the same kind of have same kind of mentality, same kind of pressure.
A few comments I want to highlight from this chapter. You write that Shenzhen and Guangdong were often denounced as having sweatshop factories with very diduan, with very low level production, especially compared to the likes of Suzhou, which had a much higher starting point by only attracting these like Gaoduan MNCs. But at the same time, it was actually the fact that they started so low on the value chain, which was something that was able to help them kind of slowly crawl up. The other thing which I thought was fascinating was just this mentality difference that you were able to tease out in some of your survey research, with only 30% of Jiangsu managers versus 60% of those in Guangdong believing it's even worth it to invest in R&D in the first place, which is a fascinating little manifestation of how these kind of wrinkles in circumstance of development from the 90s end up playing out and really influencing the decisions that firms end up making.
Oh yeah, exactly. It's probably I don't remember the exact. It's roughly 30% in Jiangsu and 60% of in Guangdong, because I conducted the survey in 2011, and it's like you can just judge from what entrepreneurs are doing and what they're saying, right? So in Jiangsu, there is like a very widespread saying that I found is if you do not innovate, you are waiting to perish. If you do innovate, you are actively seeking to perish. Right. So either way, you're going to perish. So why don't I just wait to perish instead of active? Like if I can wait to perish, basically they use the word die, but die means perish. I just translate it in this. So if I wait to perish, maybe I will perish like 10 years later. For example, if I actually seek to perish, let's say I innovate and actually seek to perish, I will perish like tomorrow, right? Or perish next month. Why should I do that? That's the saying, right? That's the saying. Whereas in Guangdong, the firms are like this. Okay. Oh, you know what? It makes a lot more money to make motherboard of the computer rather than to make the mouse of computer. Let's just do it, and let's do it tomorrow and see what it will result or something. It's like that, and I was like, you guys are just not really afraid of them. No, if we fail, we can just venture into something else. I mean, it's kind of very different environment. They're just they're like more open to what they want to try.
So before we talk about the present and future, let's go way back. So you, in your final or second to last chapter, I get talk about how these differences in 21st century economic policy perhaps have their root in the Qing dynasty. Writing that, so what were the differences back in the late Qing and Republican era of Jiangsu province versus Guangdong?
Well, yes. So when I thought about these regional differences, I started to ask myself why they were so different in the first place. For example, why these in Jiangsu areas, and part of the thing is in Shandong as well. I didn't talk too much about Shandong, but it's exactly the same thing. It seems like there's much more need to control and more favor of a top-down kind of development model. And then I started to think why these regions are so different even before this period, even what is the historical roots of those. And I found that because in the Jiangsu region in general, officials typically like to leap forward, likely to show their political achievements and kind of being politically passionate and pursue that political passion in the form of, for example, how many in the exam period, how many Jingshi that Jiangsu produce, how many Zhuangyuan that Jiangsu produce. It's very impressive because they wanted to be politically loyal, and they also wanted to supersede in their political achievement. And this goes down to even in the later on, briefly before the reform era, in the Mao era, that they actually, you would think that in the Great Leap Forward itself, Jiangsu would not be, Jiangsu doesn't look like a region that would produce like these billions of whatever, how many tons of the steel, right? But they're actually one of the few provinces that were able to do that together with those northeast regions, more heavy industry regions. And even after the Great Leap Forward, they're talking about the small Great Leap Forward, like a new not small, but a new Great Leap Forward that was like briefly under Hua Guofeng, but then later Hua Guofeng didn't come to power and Deng Xiaoping rise. But you can see the mentality is always like that. They want to supersede in doing things. They want to have their political achievement established, but they want to establish like shortly. They don't want to. They do not seem to have much patience. And Guangdong,
Beijing's running dogs, perhaps too much.
It could be. I wouldn't say that exactly they follow whatever Beijing say, because I also have good evidence that here and there they didn't follow exactly. For example, in earlier, foreign direct investment attraction period, you're supposed to just bring in joint ventures, but in Jiangsu's period, in Jiangsu region, they actually brought in how do I say that? They actually brought in a lot more multinational corporations, like wholly owned, not joint venture, wholly foreign owned firms more than they typically are, because the local government actually at that time don't have match funds to do the joint venture, and that's later also trickled down to the problem of not lacking the horizontal linkages or lacking down the lower linkages with domestic local firms and narrowing their development coalition. But in Guangdong, the picture are quite different because they're just much more practical, that they focus on practical economic development, and much earlier on, that there's not the same level of political mobilization in the Guangdong era that goes way back to Guangdong's history and things like that. But that's like a century's history that people have to talk. So there's a lot of things in it.
Yeah, so let's contrast a little bit with Guangdong and how they seem to care less about the directives for Beijing and focus more on, or the bureaucrats at least focus much more on the practicalities of economic developments at the expense of whatever was politically correct over the past, I guess, 150 plus years.
Yeah. So for example, there are various episodes in the book itself that talked about it, but I'm just, that region just have less of a interest earlier on, even to for people to become bureaucrats. They're not like that interested to say, it's my dream to become a politician or bureaucrat. So that's less of the region's culture. And the bureaucrats are like more, sometimes have very vague line with the business and then more merged with business. So during the Mao era, there's various political campaigns, of course, but they're not very into it. Like they're more care about their daily life. There is some various depictions by other leading scholars, Ezra Vogel's book, for example, that says that document the entire Guangdong, especially Guangzhou region and a region border around Guangzhou, because at that time Shenzhen was not in existence like Shenzhen is a small fishing village, so that's why it's very hard to find a relative documentary that really about Shenzhen. But in the Guangdong region, it's like they're not that into those political campaigns. And this is, of course, not to even mention that in the very early reform period that they basically protected those small private enterprises. Some of them are under registered, sort of under connective enterprises, as like wearing red hats. Some of them are kind of this is interesting, some of them are even under the hat of a foreign FIE, foreign investment enterprise in China, because they seek a little bit of investment overseas. That will give them a status. But in reality, they're actually domestic enterprises that just bring in a little bit of investment from overseas, but that would change their status and allow them to exist and prosper.
What are the differences and similarities in the policies you've focused on researching in the Hu era versus what we're seeing nowadays with Xi Jinping and Made in China 2025?
Oh, that's a terrific question. And that really gets to the core of the current status of innovation. The Made in China 2025 actually was out in the earlier period of the Xi regime. So when they first came out, there are actually more connection with the Hu era policy. And at first, I thought the Made in China 2025 itself is actually a welcome move, because it goes beyond the only emphasize indigenous innovation, essentially saying we have to have our core technology of how to make chips or how to make airplanes on our own, right? From that end to a more emphasis on advanced manufacturing in general, which are China's more general, broader manufacturing capacity. I have to point out, though, is that it is something that China uses to brand the current upgrading initiative. But it's not like everything China are doing currently in terms of domestic industrial upgrading are strictly just adhering to the Made in China 2025. The same thing, just like a lot of China's outward investment are branded under the Belt and Road Initiative, but that's not exactly like every piece of thing is really doing what it's supposed to do. So I think in the Xi era, overall, there's more of a top-down initiative building. There's more of a top-down re-centralization process involved. For example, they started to recheck the status of those high-tech firms to see if they're really high-tech firms and if they really can do their job, if they're really actually eligible for the tax break that they're enjoying, right? I don't know how to interpret this. On the one hand, you could say, well, yeah, so that means like previously those bureaucrats who do not want to evaluate the bad outcomes, those bureaucrats who gave the firm large pockets of money and or gave them tax exemption randomly, and now we can evaluate whether these firms are indeed really the high-tech firms. But on the other hand, it also means that there is less authorization of the local initiatives. The locals are losing their authorities to take their initiatives. And I do not see this as being good for future or China's future industrial capacity, because in the past the story has always when you control these regions, right? The regions that actually succeed are the region that gradually move from bottom to up. It's not the region that at the very beginning you have a very top-down sort of industrial policy just pouring down there and then immediately you will see the results. I don't think so.
So on the one hand, you see this push for centralization, but I think as your book and as this podcast has attested to, there's still, it's still a big challenge for Beijing to make sure that everyone's lining up with their proposals. And, China is an enormous place, and centralization, especially for localized economic policy, may not end up being the best solution for these various regions trying to develop and rise up the value chains in their own particular ways.
So I would say that this is where that we can draw lessons from China, and the broader lesson is just you have to evaluate which development stages you are, and the economic policies implemented. Every country has their own economic policies, and the economic policy implemented have to be compatible with your own development stage, and that we are currently in a stage, a lot of developing countries are also too in a stage that are much more integrated in this global production, global value chain, and their production process also much more fragmented. And if that is the case, then it's less likely that just continues top-down, this kind of very traditional top-down industrial upgrading process or program would likely to succeed. You have to pay attention to local bottom-up initiatives, and that is something that's very hard to maintain nowadays at the local level, and that kind of worries me some too, because local bureaucrats somehow have this mentality nowadays, are like, I would rather not do things than being wrong. So they're not taking any initiatives anymore at all.
Just because they're worried about the potential consequences.
Yeah, the same thing as, in 2014, I actually returned to China to do a follow-up interview in order to complete the book manuscript. And it's very hard to find bureaucrats who wanted to continue to talk to me anymore. Those bureaucrats who went a banquet with me or talk to me in their own office or in the seminar room, they are much more cautious. So they're more comfortable to say, you just look up our government website and here is the pamphlet you can read from, but they do not actually accept interviews. Yeah, so that is, I'm just saying that if, I mean, I'm not saying that can happen everywhere. I mean, in some of the bigger cities such as Suzhou and Shenzhen, um, or somewhere else, maybe they're more sensitive, especially that when I asked that for being interviewed, well, I was very dumbheaded too, that I ask the person for interview, whereas later on I find this person's direct head, the head of like only one level above her, that her head, her boss basically was just arrested for the anti-corruption campaign. So that's why they're being very cautious. So I guess I asked the wrong person also at the wrong time.
So it seems like this sort of provincial level research has been getting harder and harder to do over the past few years. Any advice to other young researchers out there who want to focus on this more local type of work, and what you would advise them to do?
Well, I think still, in the end of the day, you still have to you cannot only talk to the Beijing officials, and nowadays you cannot just say, I talk to the minister of this. It's not possible, right? So you cannot, actually, it's not even possible to say I only talk to the political elites at the center level. You have to go deeper into province or city and to carry out your research and to know the real story. That's just, you have to do it. And when it comes to advice, I think it's just really depend on which regions you're looking at, and just be sensitive to what particular characteristic of the region is and how they fit into the national picture. But I think the bigger advice is really you need to go there to do the research. Nowadays, a lot of other researchers, they don't actually go to the localities and don't go to these cities to do field work anymore. That's the thing. Part of this is because of a much harsher research environment, right? But part of it is because of availability of a huge big data. Like I use some big data in my book as well, but that the use of big data thing cannot replace the on-site firsthand material, firsthand story. Well, if it's too hard to interview bureaucrats, try to interview some business. Usually it's not that hard. Or go like a level down, maybe to the county level will be slightly better. That's just my personal advice. But I would certainly hope more researchers to do more updated work nowadays, because given that it's actually much harder to do research, these kind of practice would be actually more precious for us.
It sounds like you had a blast. It sounds like you had so much fun.
Yeah, it's absolutely.
All right. Ling, thanks so much for coming on China Econ Talk.
Oh, thanks very much. And thanks again for inviting me. And I really enjoyed our chat.
China Econ Talk is edited by Jason McRonald and Kaiser Guo, and is a proud member of the Sinica Network from SUP China. For other great shows on China, check out the Caixin Sinica Business Brief, the Pan Daily Tech Buzz China, the New Voices Podcast, and of course, the Sinica Podcast, now in its 9th year. Until next week.
They say being a parent is a full-time job, but I already have one of those. Luckily, I use Instacart to help me order everything I need while I'm stuck in meetings all day. So while Instacart is helping me get groceries, snacks for school lunches, and something for at-home happy hour, I get more time back to juggle my day job and my mom job. Save time by downloading the Instacart app or visit instacart.com to get $20 off your first order using the code INGREDIENTS20. Offer valid for a limited time. Minimum order $35. Delivery subject to availability. Additional terms apply.